All right. Well, I'm really pleased to get on this call with Stephen, or SM Dunning. If you look at the cover of his book, his website, he's the author of the Perilous Time Saga, the first of which just came out this year called Suzy and the Magic Turnip. There's another one forthcoming, another two forthcoming. One that I've seen and worked on. I'm excited, Stephen, because we worked on this book together. Right, you let me come in and do some editing after kind of hearing about it for a while, and also we about a history because you were my long-suffering advisor back in grad school. And so, yeah, thank you for being willing to jump on this little interview and talk about the book.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, why don't we start off just because most of the people who watch this won't know who you are. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh,
Pre Suzy, pre Perilous Time Saga.
okay. I was an English instructor at Douglas College for many years, maybe 25 years, and I was an English prof at Trinity Western for about 10 years. I did my education. I was very fortunate. I did my PhD at Cambridge. I happened to be in the same college as C.S. Lewis when he was at Cambridge and met people who knew Lewis. So that was pretty cool. Um, I am the founder, along with Monica Hilder, of the Inklings Institute of Canada, where we study all things Inklings. And I'd like to think that some of those studies have had some influence on what I've written. So, and basically, I'm retired now and mostly a grandfather. Sort of seems to be what my main job at the present is, and writing. Yeah.
Very cool. And for those of you who don't know the institutions Stephen is talking about, they're based in the lower mainland of British
Mm.
Columbia, where I grew up and where I lived for many years, which is how I got to know you as a student 15 years ago now. So,
Really? Goodness.
yeah, almost 15 years ago.
Really?
Um,
That's
yeah.
surprising.
So, you've written this trilogy,
Yes.
the first of which is now in people's hands and readers are digging in. Tell us, without any spoilers, what are readers in for? What is this story about?
Right. Well, the first thing I want to say is, well, there's a couple of things I want to say. So this is throat clearing. Um, the first is that I could understand people's reluctance about buying the first book of a series if they're wondering if the author is going, like George Martin, right? um, Hoping that the person doesn't croak, before gets it finished. But I'm happy to say that, as Frank just said, the second book is with the publisher now, and the third book is written, and we'll be working on that together, I hope, shortly. So it is all written. Second thing I'd like to say about the book for those who might never have seen it, here's a good picture, is that there's quite a shift in tone early on in the book. So what I'm going to describe here may sound a little silly, but trust me, if you stick with it, you'll find that it ceases to be entirely silly. The synopsis, I don't trust myself, so I'm going to read the synopsis on the back of the book because this way I know there won't be any spoilers. Okay. Suzy is growing up fast in troubled times. Crops are failing, the world is starving, and a shadowy global elite appears to be behind it all. But when Suzy decides to spy on her peculiar next door neighbor, that's Mrs. Limpke, she discovers a lot more than she bargained for. Is the turnip that lives in Mrs. Limpke's secret backyard chamber just another cruciferous vegetable, or is it something else entirely? Let me just say that the mystery of the turnip is one of the central mysteries of the series. Perhaps even the key to unlocking mysteries of time and space that can save the world. These questions lead Suzy on an odyssey of exploration and self discovery that takes her not just to the other side of the world, but into parallel dimensions where her sense of reality is shaken to its core. The mysterious turnip has powers that draw out Suzy's own hidden potential, powers that put her and her magical charge in great danger from dark forces that tolerate no rivals and no interference with their nefarious plans. Years ago, Susie's parents disappeared, and her aunt and uncle can only do so much to protect her. Caught up in the struggle, along with a team of other special teens and their mentors, Susie begins to realize that the magic she discovers through the turnip might not just save the world, but also hold the key to understanding the true nature of reality. But how can Susie unlock the secrets of time and space while dealing with all the awkward struggles of a young teen? Can her quest to understand herself and her place in this perilous world succeed in a universe that's weirder and harder to comprehend than she ever could have imagined? So that's it with non spoilers.
There we go. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, um, let's just start with this question. What inspired you to write this story?
Okay. I suppose I'd like to say I was it was the divine afflatus. It was I'd like to say that that's true at some level, but I can cite some more mundane or at least causes that I'm aware of. Um, the first one, and I think we'll get around to this later, perhaps, is the fact that I read literature for so many years and taught it and enjoyed it so much. And at the back of my mind, I always had this sort of question about whether I ought to try my hand at it, but it sort of just hung around back there and didn't amount to much. Um, and the second thing I'd like to note is, and it had to do with really the time of life. If you study the Inklings, you realize how productive they were. They had full time, like Owen Barfield had a full time career as a solicitor. Lewis was a full time lecturer and academic, as was Tolkien. And Charles Williams, I suppose what he did at the Oxford University Press could be called work, but that would be a euphemistic description. Mostly, I think he just went around and had fun and wrote things. But but the point is that I didn't manage my time really well enough, I think, to be able to have an academic career or to teach and to write. I tend to like blocks of time to do things in. And when I retired, that really opened up. Okay. So that was a big thing. I ended up having the time. I didn't have any more excuses, really, I suppose. The third thing that I might point to would be I recall at one of our Inklings Institute. Now we have this institute that's affiliated with the university that Frank mentioned. It is probably the preeminent one that studies the Inklings in Canada, and we have regular events. At one of these events, there was, I think it was a film on the legacy of C.S. Lewis, and I remember this quite clearly. And towards the end of it, the narrator issued a challenge of sorts, and the challenge was um, for those who love the Inklings to be willing to follow in their footsteps. And it was then that I realized that probably the best way to honor the Inklings wasn't to write more academic papers, but it was to try to do what they had done, which was to try to offer something creative to the world. Now, not that I'm disparaging academic enterprises, which can also be creative. I did enough of it, but there's a great deal of difference between writing something fictional and writing an academic paper. Um, So that challenge, I really took that to heart. I thought, well, if you really value these folks, why not try to do what they did at some level, right? And the fourth thing, and probably the the biggest thing, was my grandchildren. Um, Now, I had told stories to my own boys. I have two boys, and from them, we ended up with six grandchildren, which is wonderful. And but my own boys liked stories, and I used to tell them quite a few. But my grandchildren are insatiable and unreasonable and very demanding. And so I would end up telling them endless stories and I would forget them. That's so weird. Like 2 months later, I would go back to, you know, we'd start talking about something or other, and the kids would remember some totally weird, obscure thing about a flying pizza or whatever it happened to be. And I'd have no idea. They'd have to tell me the story again. But But the point is that they really did demand stories and really seemed to enjoy them. And I thought, and then I used to read to them, of course, and I'd read some of the stuff that they were reading, and I'd think, oh my goodness, I can't be this bad. You know, anything I'm going to write's got to be at least this good, which is kind of an odd thing to say, but it was true. So I thought, well, why not? And so I started writing in a more systematic way and consistent. And I really started to get going on the Suzy stories. I think it was during Lent in COVID, during those first lockdowns, and I really started doing, and I got into this discipline, and so that seemed to be it. There were a lot of things that came together, but one of the big inspirations, of course, was the grandchildren. Yeah.
That's great. Well, I think we can feel some of that pandemic influence
That's
in the setup for the book.
a good point. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, like you don't your story doesn't have a pandemic at the heart of it, and yet there are similarities, I think,
Hmm.
that I'll leave readers to discover as they dive
Hmm.
in.
Hmm.
I want to go back to your third point first, and so you talk about how you spent years and years studying literature and being a great reader of literature.
Yeah.
You're often the person I point to when I tell people how when I learned actually how to read well, thanks to your quizzes, which
Sorry
were
about that.
brutal. And that's a story for another day. But
Yeah.
but that really taught me to pay attention while I read, and also
Hmm.
just your love of literature, right? Now, but
Yeah.
that can be very daunting to go from somebody who's a great reader and a great lover of literature to someone willing to put the pen to the page and then invite
Hmm.
others to take that kind of critical eye to what they've done.
Hmm.
So, what was that process like going from kind of the critic, as it were, or the teacher, into the seat of the author?
That's a very good question. And daunting is a good word, although I just decided I was going to do it anyway. But as you suggest, if you study literature for long enough, you really do come to recognize what makes certain books work really well. I think you really do become aware, and I won't call it mechanics because that is too mechanical, and it's not really a mechanical process. It's something else, and I hope to talk about that a bit later too. But I will say that when you really know why a great book is great and works really well, that gives you an advantage, but it's daunting because you also know what you're going to be measured against. In fact, what you will measure yourself against. And you have to get past that in a way. Um I think what I learned is that I where I came to the point that what I was going to do is in my own small way as I learn, this is kind of offering. And I think you have to do it that way. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Absolutely right. It's a good question. It was daunting, but it also helped because I did learn certain things. Um, it's a lot harder to do though than to it's harder to do it than to recognize it when
Yeah,
it's done. Yeah,
that
very
is so
much so.
true.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you talked about the mechanics,
Hmm.
recognizing that that term might be not quite apt for describing a story. But
Uh-huh.
what would you say about that? You said maybe more about that later. Let's dive into that now.
Okay.
What did you learn that you were able to
Uh,
bring into your works?
this is this is quite interesting. Um, One of the works that helped me to think about what I was experiencing as I was writing was Dorothy Sayers wrote a book called The Mind of the Maker. I don't know if we ever studied that in class. Did you ever?
Oh no,
No, I
we
used to
didn't.
teach it in my Inklings class, but anyway, it had quite an effect on me, and she'd reflected quite deeply on what the process of creation was like. And I discovered that what she claimed was largely true. And so that was interesting. And I'll try to give you a synopsis, then I'll break it down and tell you the different stages of what I discovered. So the first thing she argues is that it is in their creativity that humans are most like God, not in their rationality, but in their creativity. And I would also point out that I think um, people like Tolkien would certainly agree with that. And he talked about the idea of subcreation in many places. But Dorothy Sayers said that the creative process finds an analogy, a theological analogy in the doctrine of the Trinity. Okay, this is very interesting. She said the general idea of the created work is like the Father. It's eternal, it's complete, it's out of time, right? And it is the thing that is behind everything that happens. So that's the idea, is linked to the Father. The Son proceeds from the Father, from the idea, but the Son has to do with the creative agent. That is the agent, not the idea, but the agent that incarnates the idea in our physical world in time. It has to, depending on the type of art, it has to reckon with things like, you know, punctuation, your skill with language, the amount of time you have, how your digestion is that day. In other words, all the complications of of incarnating an idea. That is the Son, that is the agent. So people can have great ideas, but if they don't have the capacity, they don't have the skills. Like you can think about what it would take to be a sculptor. If you don't have skill with the chisel, if you don't have a good sense, you might have this great idea of a statue, but if you don't have the physical skills, you don't have the agency to be able to complete it. And you need the right material and so forth. Now, what I discovered, it was quite interesting. So let's say with Suzy, I had a sense that, I knew the idea. And in a sense, it was kind of complete when I started it. And what I mean by that is that as I would be working on the idea, there would be certain parts that would feel right and that would reveal more of the idea. And when I recognized it, I would say, oh, yeah, that's really so. One discovers in the process of incarnating an idea, one discovers that one has been working with this idea. Are you familiar? There's this paradox in Plato that I actually experienced, and it's this. Plato says, how can you go looking for something unless you'd already know what it is? Because if you don't already know what it is, you won't recognize it when you find it. And it's that paradox. So for Plato, he ends up arguing that all learning is a kind of remembering. It's as if we have this. So let's think about this here. We have this idea. As we work to try to incarnate it in whatever medium, in this case, it's through words, we'll be discovering more about the idea, but it's not new. In a sense, it's just the revealing of something that's there. I did have that sense.
Huh.
Like, for example, I think about Tolkien's story about when the hobbits got to Bree and they ran into Strider, and Tolkien had no idea who this guy was sitting in the pub. But the whole of the Lord of the Rings ends up, but he wouldn't go away because he was kind of part of that. And I think about Margaret Lawrence, a great Canadian writer of the last generation. She said, that when she was writing, it felt like she was following her characters through a crowded marketplace, desperately trying to keep up with them. And and I thought that was a good one. But so I can say I actually did experience that it's like as you write and try to incarnate, it's almost like the idea is reaching down into time to catch and to draw those things. So that was that part. That's the idea of the idea. Then there's the agent, which is like the Son, she says. And for the spirit, she calls it the energy. And she says it's this energy that not only went into the creation of the thing, but that returns really to the Father, but through the response of the audience and the readers, one sees it. And I really sense that when I had a reader who appreciated it, like when I could see someone who got joy out of that, it was tremendously fulfilling. In fact, it was one of the great motivations to keep going. I also learned that I'm not writing for everybody, and that the energy, like in a sense, there has to be an audience for a work. I mean, a book that's not like that's unread by anybody. isn't really a book at that point. I do think that that part of the creative process is the return of the audience and the readership, right? And the energy in that. And I found that the most satisfying part of the process. And the thing that inspired me, like, I did a trilogy because I was maybe 2/3 of the way through the draft of the first book. And I was telling, I think my grandson, Thomas, he was saying, well, how close are you? And I said, well, I've got about another third to go. He said, oh, no. He said, it's got to be at least a trilogy. and, and it was funny. And I got that response from a couple, and they just, the fact that the audience, we're giving something back, and that actually did contribute to the process itself. And it was part of the, in a sense, that Trinitarian thing. So I did experience that. And I always thought, like, I kind of got the idea when Sayers was talking about it. Now, she was mostly talking about it within the context of dramaturgy, right? Being a playwright. But I really did experience something like that. Also experience my own limitations. Like you do, like just the mechanics of learning how to do so many things. And that's part of the agent, right?
Mm.
But that idea, so the idea that's there, but that you discover and reveal in time, and for the reader, it's pure revelation, right? The idea becomes revealed only in the writing of it,
Mm.
whereas the author, I think, has traffic with the idea.
Uh-huh.
So it's I don't know what you think of that, but it's a
Yeah.
wonderful book. And Sayers has a lot to say about politics, and she claims that and this is probably a good word for our age and what's going on in the world. She says, our political problems and social problems do not require engineering solutions. What they require are the kinds of solutions that a creator, an author, would come up with in dealing with problem areas of texts or creations in general.
Mm.
And they won't be engineering solutions.
Mm.
I thought that was kind of interesting.
That's a great line. Yeah.
Yeah. So that
Yeah.
comes towards the end of her book. So there you go.
Huh. Thank you.
You're welcome.
No, that was really, really helpful. I want to, so you said you discovered you didn't write for everybody.
Yeah,
I'm
for sure.
curious. So both who you discovered you are writing for
Okay.
and who you discovered that you're not writing for.
Okay, that's interesting. And I don't want to be insulting or disparaging because different readers have different tastes. I've discovered this. Like, I'll just give you an example. I love Walker Percy, great Southern writer. I think he's one of he's one of my favorite. In fact, he's one of my son's favorite. I mentioned my grandson Thomas. His second name is Walker. He was named after Walker Percy. So Walker Percy is important in the family. But I taught Walker Percy, and I discovered that there were some people in the class who read him who just had no time for him at all. There was something just rubbed him the wrong way. And I discovered that about my own reaction to things. I mean, when I first read Margaret Atwood, I had no use for her. And it wasn't until I really got into her dystopian stuff and realized just how insightful she was that I sort of opened up. But I can understand how not every writer, not every work is accessible to everybody at every stage of life. And I think the people I was writing for, one person who reviewed Suzy and the Magic Turnip said that this book will be very good for the kind of people who don't mind a good adventure, but don't mind learning something on the way. So there is, if people don't want any kind of intellectual challenges to get in the way of, their narrative lust, then this is not the book for them. There is that it's a reader who has patience enough to want to understand and
Mm.
so that's part of it. But I also recognize that, that not everything's to everybody's taste, and that's okay. So I guess the people that I'm writing for are the people who enjoy it.
Yeah.
I don't know how else to put it. And I mean, I can identify some of their qualities. Um, I mean, a lot of my beta readers happen to be uh, homeschooled, happen to be, and they were good readers for their age. And I think that helped. I think it does help.
Mm.
Maybe they were more patient. Maybe they just learned that if maybe there was something worthwhile here, if you just keep going. Maybe they were just patient and gracious. I don't know. But there you go.
Yeah. So, at what point in the process, because you've written three
Yeah.
books, at what point did you discover that?
Well, I think pretty soon, I think once people looked at it and draft, I found this, it's quite interesting that even though it's young adult fiction, and I've had very enthusiastic responses from young people, but the most enthusiastic responses I've had came from uh adults actually, where they like, for example, I'm not going to name any names, but I will just mention that I was sending chapters by email to to this mother who was giving them to her daughters to read. And she said that at some point she started reading the chapters as like before she handed them to the kids. And then the next thing is she had to go back and read all the other chapters she hadn't missed. And then she read the whole thing in a day. And I've had that happen. I've had 3 or 4 people say that when they started reading it, that they read it in a day. And that tends to be a thing that adults will do. So that made me kind of happy that they found it compelling enough that they did that. So but that's surprising. But I was told that too. I remember when I first went to publish it, one of the agents I was talking to said, you know, that one of the secret vices of a lot of people is adults enjoy young adult fiction. They won't admit it, but they do. So I think that there's
Yeah.
that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's certainly
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
Well, part of my question, I was curious, because I'm always looking at things from a kind of a writing craft standpoint.
Yeah.
So once you realize that, did that affect your writing at all? Did it change
I
anything?
No, I don't think so. I would really say I can honestly say, aside from you, my dear, uh, my dear content editor, I probably haven't changed much what I've tried to do at all. I've just tried to write it, um, and trusting that, that would work out. But I never I never tried to write to a reader.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, in that sense. So I don't know. So it didn't really change, I guess, is my answer. But I think that the editing process, with you particularly, uh, was something where I did become much more conscious of what I was doing and how I was doing it.
So I'd love to hear more about that, not in a way of for you to tell me my influence. I'm actually just curious, like
Mhm,
from your experience, because I think would be true of anyone who goes through an editing process.
mhm.
What did you learn? What
Oh
changed
my goodness.
going through that?
Well, the first thing I thought of was T.S. Eliot, who was a great consolation to me. He has a couple of great lines in the Four Quartets, and one he says that every act of writing, and the quotation here is, it's a raid on the inarticulate. I love that.
Hmm.
But he also says that one of the lessons of wisdom is of humility, and then he adds, humility is endless. Now, it was quite interesting that, as you say, and this is important for people to think about who are listening to this, that Frank was my student, and we worked together. And I mean, it's always a very fine writer. It was just getting him to write.
It's true.
and 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 anyway, so I mean, that was the nature of our relationship, because that's simply what it was. But when Frank became my editor, then that changes completely, and that's instructive. It's very, very good experience to be in the position of the neophyte needing help and guidance. It's a good exercise. It's even worse because my wife is a copy editor, and she also did a lot of the copy editing. So it's bad enough a former student, and it's even worse when your wife. but 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 it is true that that you really do. I mean, I used to tell my students this, and I discovered it. You probably never discovered this because you were such a good student, and you probably didn't really get hammered on any of your assignments. But I found students, you can insult their mother and their political party, but you talk about their writing in a way that they do not take this kindly. And 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 it's true, it's a tough thing. And so the first thing is, think about T.S. Eliot. Think about the fact that we all need correction and guidance, and we all need this, and that's something that you have to get past. If you can't
Mm.
handle that, you don't want an editor. You just don't. But on the other hand, even when you recognize a good editor, and you certainly are a very good editor, um, I remember something Margaret Atwood. I just went to within a year, I went to a big uh, talk by her at the Chan Center in Vancouver in Canada, a couple of thousand people. And she talked about the experience of editors. And she said, my editor is essential to me. But she said that in the end, it's my responsibility. And I think I've seen you write about this before as well. It is the writer's responsibility in the end to decide what to take and what not to take. And boy, that's a tough one too, right? Because
Mm.
you can be perverse. You can just say, screw this person. What do they know? Right. But you don't, but you have to be in a sense. So that's a kind of openness and discernment. So that's
Mm.
part of that process. You have to try to get your ego out of the way.
Mm.
I think that's probably the first stage of it, I
Yeah.
think. But then after that, it does just require more experience. And also you can see the product. I mean, it's interesting that if you see that it's better, and if you hear from other people that it's better too, then that's an incentive, right?
Mm.
For sure. So I don't know if that helps at
Yeah.
all, but it's getting the ego out of the way is the first thing.
No, that's all super helpful. I would kind of piggyback maybe a little bit. This is
Yeah.
your interview, but I'm going to speak in. Just talking about that discernment piece is so key. And I feel that as an editor from the other side,
Uh-huh.
it's much more enjoyable to work with somebody who offers pushback
Uh-huh.
because then there's some true collaboration. And I've had fine experiences with others who just take it all. That's fine, but I think the piece grows, the work grows far better when there is that friction. Where I'll
Uh-huh.
make a suggestion and the author goes no, right? But then usually it's never there's a difference between just the no, take a hike, and the no, but here's what I'm trying to do, and then
Yeah.
we often would have that going back and forth.
Yeah,
So
yeah, that's true.
um,
But I respect, I mean, to start with, I mean, you have to respect the person, and I do. I respect your abilities, and that makes a big difference. You had to sit on the other end of it when I was looking at your stuff. So you know what that's like, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and to be fair, probably the bashing that I had was in my undergrad before I was your student. So
Oh, right.
I,
Well,
I I
I did.
had some of those same experiences where I didn't take too kindly to professors who
Yeah,
told me
yeah.
I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah. Well, I still remember, and I still think I'm right. I remember a high school teacher who marked an essay on that I wrote on Young Goodman Brown, which became, I used to teach that. I love that short story. It's one of the most profound stories I think that's been written in American lit.
Who's that by?
Nathaniel Hawthorne,
Okay.
Young Goodman Brown. It's an amazing story. In fact, if you know the story, I'll just tell this is a little, this is kind of an Easter egg for those who want to read the book. But if you read this, if you go to my website, there's a link in the book, Suzy, to my website where the person can read the short story, the fairy tale that Suzy's reading. That fairy tale is based on Young Goodman Brown. It's a retelling in a way that I think gets at what's going on by Hawthorne. So that's just kind of a clue for people who want to look at it. But I remember in this class, I wrote about what I thought was going on in the book, and I had a strong and serious religious upbringing. And I knew kind of what Hawthorne was doing in this book. And it was a substitute English teacher in high school, and she was clueless, I thought. So anyway, I still disagreed with her. I think she objected to my use of the word fornication. Anyway, it's a long time ago, but
Yeah.
these things stick with a fella.
Yeah. Well, one of the stories I was telling recently to somebody, I think on a podcast I was doing, they're asking my first writing memory, and it
Yeah.
was of an assignment my mother gave me, and she didn't like one of my sentences. I think I wrote the sun shone dully, and she's like, the sun can't shine dully. That's impossible. But I was like, no, it can.
I agree with
Um,
you.
and she made me change it actually. But then after she had graded it, because I was homeschooled,
Yeah, yeah.
then later on when she wasn't around, I erased it and restored it to what I wanted it to be.
This
So
is the author taking responsibility.
it is. It explains an awful lot.
Yeah, there you go, man. Well,
What's
that's cool.
yeah. What's so? about the whole process. I mean, you've been
Uh,
through, start to finish now for the first book. You're working on the second. The third's kind of in progress. What surprised you the most about this process?
uh, what surprised me? That's a good question. I think again the idea of the discovery of the idea as you actually try to incarnate it, that you realize that something is kind of there working from the other direction as you're working, as you're struggling with things to give it shape. There is something I think that's working from the other direction that's doing the shaping as well. I don't know if you've ever had that experience, but it's
Sure.
that sense. Yeah. And I think that that probably surprised me. It was experiencing that the most. But I can tell you what pleased me the most if you're interested at
Please,
all.
that was actually my next question.
Yeah. Yeah. What pleased me the most was the immense pleasure I take in watching people uh enjoy, like read the book and enjoy it. I had no idea that it would be like that. Like I wrote a decent academic book and I've written lots of articles and I've given papers at conferences, and that's okay. People say, "Oh yeah, good paper." But watching, somebody light up after reading something and realizing that you brought that pleasure, uh, I mean, there's nothing like it really. I think it's just the greatest pleasure that I've experienced in many ways. Sounds weird, but I think it's true. I really do.
No,
I
makes
really
sense.
enjoy that. So that's been the thing that surprised me the most, I suppose, was how much I enjoyed that part of it.
So, what's the
Yeah.
most memorable piece of feedback that you've had so far?
Oh, oh boy.
Putting you on a spot here. I didn't prep you
I'm
with that
trying to think.
question.
No, no, no. I'm trying to think though about what it would be. Well, what it is that I mean, I think there's been a number of things, but where you would look at, say, the first three paragraphs that I sweated over in a chapter, and you'd say, just you can just get rid of those, just go right to the action. And I'm thinking, what? but 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 it's that kind of thing where you're looking at it not from really what that is too is you're trying to imagine the reader again. I was talking about it's that spirit thing, the energy, and oh yeah, I think that your focus on what you're focusing on when you talk about tension. The tension is probably actually the experience of the energy that the
Hmm.
reader would sense, and that it's a way of keeping that energy so that it's flowing and doesn't get stopped.
Hmm.
I think there's something to that. So it was when I started, it was that experience of realizing that maybe I'm getting in the way of my own story, you know? And, and I mean, I have a lot of patience. Like I just read for a living, so I would have to read all kinds of things. Uh, I mean, you could look at Richardson's Clarissa, which is like 1,000 pages of epistolary things from a woman who's been kidnapped. And it just, I mean, I think the abridged version is about 400 or 500 pages. And even that's like intolerable for most people. But it's just, so I have a lot of patience. So for
Yeah.
me, having to get through a couple of paragraphs to see but then so it made me see the story. So that was kind of that was a bit shocking, is thinking about, well, what can I? And I noticed that as I'm editing the third book myself, because that's actually what I'm doing right now. I'm going through that and looking at it. And I actually do. I mean, I've started to cut a few things, not many though. but
You're
but
waiting
there
for
you
me
go.
to come along.
That's right. I am. I want to give you something to do. Right.
Well, I like how you're connecting that the idea of dramatic tension with the energy.
Yeah.
'Cause I think there's something worth reflecting on there for sure.
Mhm.
When I was talking to some other writers recently, I kind of described it as like we actually want our readers to be uncomfortable
Yeah.
because then they're invested, right? If I'm not uncomfortable, and obviously there's limits, right? And like, we're
Yeah.
talking about a certain kind of discomfort.
Yeah.
There's other kinds of discomfort that depending on what you're writing, you don't want to
Uh,
have.
uh,
But when I'm uncomfortable, like when I'm not sure what's going to happen,
uh,
then I'm invested, and it's not just that it keeps me reading, although kind of practically speaking, it does. It's actually me telling myself and then telling the author, I care about these people
uh,
that you've described. that you've brought to life, really not just
Mhm,
described, that you've brought to life.
mhm.
Because if I wasn't uncomfortable when they're facing danger, then I don't really care. I don't really love them. Right? There's an element of that kind of going on, and I do think you're right. It is that energy that's
Yeah.
going back and forth
Yeah.
there.
It's interesting that I realize that one of my tendencies is to want to, I don't like making people uncomfortable. I actually really don't. And so that's a challenge for me. Like I want to reassure the reader,
Mm.
probably where I shouldn't. And you're pretty good at that, of saying, no, 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 no. Not here. Okay. I'll just stop reading. Like I don't need to read this thing now.
Do you
So
okay? So I'm just curious about that. I mean, that's what
yeah,
you want to do for the reader. Do you
yeah.
feel the desire for that when you're reading fiction?
No, but I also, when I think about young adults,
Mm,
I think that's one of the differences I would say between real children's literature and young adult fiction. I think with the
mm,
young adult fiction, and this just takes getting used to, you have to be willing to let the readers get uncomfortable and a little bit lost. You have
mm,
to be willing to take them into thickets and not show them the way out right away, right?
mm,
Um, I mean, I talk about this. One of the reasons, in fact, and this, and I don't know if this is worth saying here, but um, one of the reasons why reading good fiction, and by good I mean eucatastrophic, right? Fiction as a kid, is because it encourages there's a kind of dual consciousness. So I look at this from the point of view of the reader, and I need to think about this more, and I think that you checked me on this. But anyway, here's the consciousness. The reader will share in both the experience of the characters with whom they identify and with the perspective of the narrator.
mhm,
So the reader has a relationship with the narrator as well as with the characters. And at some level, even though the narrator won't provide reassurance all the time, there is, as you identify with the reader, even the characters, even though the characters can't see where they're going, and even though they're in a terrible predicament, and there's no way the reader or the character can see a way out, the fact that it works out, this is why Natalie Babbitt talks about happy endings and so forth, right? But the fact that things work out will give children in later life a resilience.
mm,
And the resilience comes from not quitting. Because if you think about The Lord of the Rings, I mean, who, Tolkien does it so magnificently in say the end of The Lord of the Rings, where what you realize is that the only way that they could be guaranteed to lose would be to quit if
mm,
they lie down and stop moving. But let's say you've read through The Lord of the Rings. Now, your experience has been of the despair that Frodo certainly feels. And notice that when Sam wants to encourage Frodo, he talks about stories.
mm,
And he says, I feel like we're in a story because what Sam has done, and he reminds Frodo, Sam has been raised on these stories that where it looks like there's no way that they can, but that they turn out because the people don't quit. So it's that dual consciousness. It's that, yes, you can fully acknowledge at some point that this feels like despair, feels like you're completely lost. But there's this other consciousness too that says that there's a higher level that we can seize from the beginning to the end, right? And you get glimpses of that as a reader when you share the narrator's point of view. It really
mm,
has to do with authority. And I think ultimately for people like Tolkien, it's the link between God as ultimate author and then the human author, right? It's that
mm,
idea. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's that
mhm,
tension. Without the tension, the book's not worth reading. So your point's very well taken. But that the reassurance can't come from little verbal cues and,
mm,
other things like that. It has to come from a determination not to quit sometimes, to be
mm.
willing to just live with it and sit with it. I don't know if that helps, but
Yeah. I mean, to stay. I mean, that's um, they talk about with when you're for people who struggle with anxiety
Mhm.
or things like that. The goal
Yeah,
is not to figure out how your life can be anxiety free,
exactly.
but to be able to sit in that moment and be okay with it not feeling the way you wanted to, and that's actually okay.
Yep.
I think it's the same principle at
Yep.
play there.
And reading the right things. You don't want one where everybody ends up dead and the world blows up and, but if you, so the kinds of things people read are very important, but reading can help with that process of allowing people to live with anxiety and to, as you say, to sit with it and stay with it. I mean, even like the romantics, like John Keats, he talked about this idea of negative capability. And it is being able to sit with uncertainty
Mm,
and to not seek a premature closure, right? That what if you can hold out, usually the closure that one achieves is much better.
mm.
Man, it's kind of interesting to think about that.
Wow.
But yeah, you're right. But I'm not good at that. My natural instinct is to want to comfort and it'll
I
be
think that's
okay.
most people. I
Yeah.
think I think that's most writers I work with.
Uh-huh.
I had to learn that the hard way. So I think it's the natural instinct for sure.
Uh-huh.
Um, because we feel like we have to do that for as a responsibility. It's
Uh-huh.
in some ways it's like parenting. It's like, your natural instinct as a parent is to make sure all the really bad stuff stays away.
Uh-huh.
And it's like, well, okay, yeah, there needs to be some boundaries and you need to offer some protection. But if we don't let our kids have some of those tastes, perhaps through reading, perhaps through their life experiences,
Uh-huh.
probably both. Um, it's going to happen at some point.
Yep.
So yeah,
Yeah, but you're right about being a parent. I won't name any names, but I have some good friends who are I have a good friend who taught philosophy for a lot of years, and before he had children of his own, he was happy to take his students into the deepest, darkest thickets he could find and leave them there to find their way out. And I had a philosophy teacher myself like that, who I think I would say did some damage to students, but the ones who survived got tougher. but but here's what's interesting is
yeah,
when this philosophy prof, first one I was talking about, had a child, things changed.
mm,
He understood
uh-huh,
that it's a lot different motivation because he started to realize that the students he's teaching are somebody's children.
uh,
That and that the same affection and care and nurturing sense. But yeah, that's a tension, right? It's a tension between
uh-huh,
the desire to nurture and the desire to stretch.
yeah.
Yeah. But that's like it'd be interesting to create this whole it's kind of the therapeutic approach to writing. Anyway,
I'm sure someone's done it.
yeah, I'm sure
I
too.
haven't bumped into it, but
Yeah, there you
yeah,
go.
there's things to learn and there's other things there. So
Yeah.
thank you. Before I let you go, is there anything we haven't talked about or touched on that you would like to touch on before we wrap?
No, I think that's been good. I'm really grateful for having had a chance to talk with you this way, and I hope that your viewers enjoy it and buy the book.
Yes, it's available on Amazon. Do check out Stephen's website, smdunning.com. You can read more about him and the stories there, as well as find the little Easter egg story, which is referred to in the first book, but not included in there.
Yeah.
So thank you, Stephen. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It was a
Appreciate
pleasure.
your books and look forward to doing this again sometime.
Absolutely.